All right, welcome everybody to Racket News. I'm Matt Taibbi. Can everybody hear me? Because I'm such a Luddite on the technical side, I always have to ask that at the beginning of any broadcast. So if anybody's in the comments, just to make sure I got everything working, let me know if you can hear me. All right, I got a thumbs up. So thanks everybody for coming out. This story has been in the works for weeks. It's the reason it's been a little bit quiet around Racket lately. It's one of the reasons. Today, and I'm going to tell the whole story, and I'm going to explain why the story's on public and not on Racket, and the whole thing. Today, on public, my partner from the Twitter files, Michael Schellenberger, along with, here I'm going to change the view a little bit here, along with Alexander Gutentag. We all work together on a story. This is the first of a three-part series that gets to the origins of the Trump-Russia story. And by the end of this broadcast, hopefully I can explain that I think we need to start rethinking what exactly the Trump-Russia story was, whether we want to call it Russiagate. We've been, I think, going by the news that we got, we've been led down kind of a false path for many years, and only now does it seem like we're beginning to start to look at this story correctly. So let's look at the story. It's titled, CIA Had Foreign Allies Spy on Trump Team Triggering Russia Collusion Hoax, Sources Say. So let me answer a couple of questions off the bat. First of all, why is this story on public? Why is it not on Racket? As you know, folks are familiar with the fact that I've collaborated with Alexander and Michael several times before in the last year or so. Since the Twitter files, of course, Michael and I worked together in the Twitter files. We testified together in Congress, and we worked on other breaking news stories, including a story about the intelligence community identifying workers in the Wuhan laboratory who reportedly were the first recorded victims of COVID. We also did a story about the Slack communications of the authors of the so-called proximal origins study. So, and in that story, basically, we got the internal communications of the people who wrote a very influential paper for Nature magazine that was turned out to be the premise for the idea that COVID did not come from a lab, that it had zoonotic origin. As we saw in the documents, the doctors were, wait, no sound? People are saying no sound. Nobody can hear me. You can hear me. Okay, great. All right. Sorry, that was just it seems like a random person couldn't hear me. Not a random person, a valued listener and valued viewer. So in those previous stories, we all worked together. It came out great. We did some stories in Racket. We did some stories in public. But essentially, it comes down to this. This is their scoop. I just helped them work it up. I had sort of the privilege to help report this story out. This is a significant story. It's more than a one-person job. It's more than a two-person job. It's probably more than a three-person job. We had to scramble even just to get this much out as quickly as we could. So this being their story, it comes out on public first, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a lot of content on Racket about this. In fact, we now have a surfeit of leads and other places, other things to follow up. That's going to occupy us for a little bit. So what is this story? Well, let me start first by sharing a screen. You might remember this document. This is the so-called Nunes memo, which was sent by California Congressman and then Chairman of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Devin Nunes, in February of 2018. This memo was widely panned in the media. In fact, it was so panned that Nancy Pelosi called for Nunes to step down for writing a deliberately dishonest memo. This memo argued that there had been widespread improprieties in the FBI's efforts to obtain FISA authority on a Trump aide, a former Trump aide called Carter Page. And it went on and listed a series of missteps, errors, omissions, et cetera, essentially saying that there had been an improper surveillance operation involving at least one person dating back to the summer of 2016. Again, this was widely thanks for the folks saying correcting me and saying Nunes, Devin Nunes. This memo was hugely controversial. It was panned by everybody in media. There was a bogus story that actually became a kind of the subtext of one Twitter Files piece. There was a bogus story that this thing had been propagandized by Russian bots. That turned out to be kind of a hoax that was generated by the Hamilton 68 website. It was one of the revelations of the Twitter Files. It's one of the first things that Michael and I worked on together. But why is this document important? This document is important because it was the product of an investigation by this House Permanent Select Committee on Investigations, better known as HPSI. We now know that there were basically two teams. There was a main team of HPSI investigators that was operating out of an office on the Hill at Congress. Then there was a smaller team that operated out of what they call a small room in Langley, whose actions were closely monitored by the CIA. Their ingress and egress was controlled by the CIA. This smaller team had to work on site. They conducted sort of a separate investigation from the rest of the group. But I bring up the Nunes memo, the Nunes memo, because the story that we are basing our exposés this week, it comes from the same pile of documents and sources and human sources that this Nunes memo comes from. Now, remember, this group of investigators uncovered not only the improper FISA surveillance, and they were vindicated in their judgments about this a year later when the Obama appointed Inspector General of the Justice Department, Michael Horowitz, issued a very long and blistering report documenting 17 errors and omissions in the preparation of that FISA warrant, and basically everything that was in this original Nunes memo was expanded at great length, along with many other things that the public didn't know in the Horowitz report. The Horowitz report, for instance, is where we found out that the story about the infamous P tape came from a subsource of Christopher Steele's, the British spy, and that it was something that came up in quote unquote in jest over beers, and there really was no solid sourcing behind that. We found out that the CIA thought that document was just internet rumors and was against putting it in an intelligence assessment. But this was solid information, solid work, solid research. They also had a hand in uncovering the crucial fact that the Steele dossier was paid for by the Hillary Clinton campaign. This is one of countless details that, had we known contemporaneously, had the facts come out at the same time as the original story, we might have had a completely different understanding of this entire scandal. As it was, it seems like a characteristic of this entire scandal is that there was always a delay. The people who were doing the bad thing tend to be a year, 2 years, 3 years, in some cases even 4 years ahead of release of the documents. And today's story is an indication of that. This Nunes memo, this HIPSI investigation, they got some stuff out, but not all of it. There has been, from that time, dating all the way back to 2018, an ongoing struggle to declassify or release other reports and other research that this group did. And some of it ended up being declassified in the waning days, actually in the waning hours of the Trump administration. I'm going to show you some of that documentation. It was widely overlooked because the world was losing its mind over January 6th at that time. But some of it didn't get out. There was a crucial 17 to 19 page report that remains, quote unquote, in a vault at Langley, never left the grounds of the CIA. And a lot of our story is based on, basically, we're reconstructing recollections from people who saw that document. We finally got enough people to tell the same story that we feel comfortable in going forward with this. And I'm going to go through the story quickly. And by the way, I strongly urge everybody to go to public and check it out themselves. And if you're not subscribed, to subscribe. Obviously, we're independent journalists. It's a business. So it is paywalled. There's nothing I can do about that, but I am going to try to bring you up to date on as many key facts that I was involved with helping uncover as possible. And I think Michael, Alexandra, and I are going to be doing a lot of stuff in the coming weeks about this material. So there are three main stories that are going to come out of this. The first one is today's, and let me go back to the story. CIA had foreign allies spy on Trump team, blah, blah, blah. All right. Multiple credible sources tell Public and Racket that the United States intelligence community, including the Central Intelligence Agency, illegally mobilized foreign intelligence agencies to target Trump advisors long before the summer of 2016. As you know, if you followed the story at all, and for most people, they didn't have a choice. This was a story that was everywhere. It was omnipresent for the first 3 years of its existence. You could not get out of watching, hearing about this tale. It does, however, get very weedsy very quick, and so certain details may not be public knowledge. Some may be, but for people out there who don't know, the formal FBI investigation into Donald Trump began on July 31st, 2016. It was codenamed Crossfire Hurricane. There was an awful lot of really stupid code naming that went on in this operation. But the formal investigation began on July 31st. That date is important because we have significant evidence that there was a lot of surveillance that went on well before that. The first documented episodes, some people placed them in March of 2016. However, just before we went on the air here, we're starting to hear about other things that happened in late 2015. I had heard stories to that effect going back to 2015. Unfortunately, it's just been very hard to report this stuff because there just hasn't been a way to get it out. Most people know that there was a major effort to declassify a lot of these documents. Trump did, in fact, declassify an entire binder of documents that included a lot of this material. However, for technical reasons that are difficult to explain and are going to be the subject of tomorrow's story, most of the stuff didn't get out. However, there's stuff, there are enough things that sources agree upon, that they remember, and that we can cross-confirm with other public documentation that we finally feel comfortable enough to report this stuff. So let's just go through the basics of what's in the story, and then I'm going to talk about what else is out there that would tend to make you believe that this is confirmable. All right. After Public and Racket were told that President Barack Obama's CIA Director John Brennan identified 26 Trump associates for Five Eyes allies to target. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Five Eyes partnership, it's an intelligence partnership between the famed Anglophone nations, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They were our closest intelligence partners, and it seems that there were a lot of the surveillance activity that went on involving Trump associates took place overseas, on the territory of one of these nations, and with the help, in many cases, of their intelligence agencies. A source confirmed that the IC had identified them as people to bump or make contact with or manipulate. We heard a lot about bumping. They were targets of our own intelligence community and law enforcement, targets for collection and misinformation. And we had some sources who said things like this. They were making contacts and bumping Trump people going back to March 2016. Again, just to repeat, where does this information come from? Sources close to the investigation say that from 2019 to 2020, HIPSI investigators continued working out of a small room in Langley and had access to raw logs and communications from agencies like the CIA and the National Security Council. This is going to become important in the third story in this series. That's on Thursday. That's the one that I worked on the most, but we'll get back to that when that comes out. The first of the intelligence community's surveillance targets appeared to be former Defense Intelligence Agency head and would-be Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, Cambridge academic Stefan Halper, one of the few outed confidential human sources from the Crossfire Hurricane probe, approached Flynn in March 2016, or at least he wrote a report about Flynn in March 2016, even though he actually wasn't in attendance at the dinner that he reported about. And then we have another quote. The Stefan Halper story is ridiculous. He was the consultant to write papers that weren't papers and paid inflated sums like $400,000. He was conducting bumps and intelligence contacts. I'm going to come back to this thing, but the Halper approached at least 4 Trump targets that included Flynn. It included Carter Page, who was on the FISA. Sam Clovis was, I believe, another one. Then there was George Papadopoulos. And he was paid a total of, awarded a contract of $411,000 on September 26th of 2016, which is 3 days after the first story about Carter Page appeared in the American press. And we'll get to why we feel comfortable writing about that sum, writing about why this arrangement and why we think it might be connected in a moment. Another key detail that we were told, and this is something that has been speculated on a great deal. Joseph Mifsud, the Maltese professor who allegedly approached George Papadopoulos and told him a story, allegedly, about information that the Russians had, derogatory information about Hillary Clinton. This became a story that allegedly was told to an Australian diplomat. The diplomat walks in off the street in London to the American embassy, where future CIA director Gina Haspel just happens to be the station chief for the CIA. Tells a story about hearing this weird tale from a person who was subsequently described in warrant applications and all kinds of other memoranda as a suspected Russian agent. Well, we were told, or at least that the people who investigated this matter were looking at the raw communications back and forth, and one of the things that didn't make sense to them is that they kept one of the people who was being put under surveillance kept running into a professor who was supposedly a Russian but really MI6. Now, people have speculated about that, but this is the first time that someone's claimed concretely that Joseph Mifsud was working for a Western intelligence agency. Now, do we know absolutely for certain that that's true? No. We know we have a very strong belief that that's in a document that has not been declassified, and that if declassified, that we'll find some of that information. But we heard it from enough people that we felt it was important to include it. We were unable to, of course, locate him because he's been missing since the beginning of this scandal, even though he had no history of disappearing, although we've heard some interesting stories about where he is exactly at this moment. So that was in the story. Documents released by journalist John Solomon in his lawsuit against the Justice Department, Sullivan v. Garland, show that the FBI's versions do not match Trump's unreleased declassified documents. Those documents include the FBI's notes on its investigation into Page, an interview with Steele. This is going to be another weedsy detail, but there were some documents that were declassified really in the last hours of the Trump presidency. A few of them got out. John Solomon, the much pilloried journalist who writes for Just the News, he wrote You Strike for the Hill. There were a lot of hit pieces written about him in major Western newspapers. He is the sort of one of the designated National Archives representatives for Trump. So he pursued these documents, and I just include the detail that when those documents finally came out, they didn't exactly match some of the documents that had already been released partially or with redactions. We don't know the full extent of what that means yet, but we thought that was worth mentioning. The investigators created a binder that blew up the assessment, and that's the Intelligence Community Assessment of 2017. That's the subject of the story 2 days from now that I spent most of my time on. They created a binder that blew up the assessment but couldn't get it out because the CIA controlled it. A source told it. This gets back to what I said before, that particular team, their ingress and egress were controlled. They were monitored on-site. They were monitored off-site, according to numerous sources. But the key detail in all of this, in this first story, is this number 26. There were 26 people who were placed under surveillance. There was a lack of predication, apparently. And there's another detail that's very important. We were told that this was not done for any national security reason, that this was done strictly for political purposes. And I'm going to see if I can find the quote. All right, no, it's not there. Hang on a second. Sorry, folks, there's a lot of stuff here, and I just want to make sure I get as much of it as I can and explain as much of it as I can. Yeah, so one of the key quotes, and one of the key things we learned was that this operation, these surveillance episodes, they did not have a legitimate national security reason. Now, or at least they didn't in most cases. We haven't seen every single instance, but just to give you an example of the kind of things that we were told, we asked, did this have a broader intelligence community objective? Answer, no, this had nothing to do with our relationship with Russia. It was just leveraging capabilities to undermine a rookie, unprepared Trump campaign as though they were easy marks. And this is talked about over and over again. And this is done on both the front end and the back end. So both in the request for surveillance, and that can be through informants, that could be signals intelligence, which in most cases began overseas. We even heard stories about informants implanting data collecting malware on the personal devices of some of these targets. So, but the important thing is that there was no overarching national security issue. You might remember there were stories in the New Yorker, for instance, in the Guardian, written by Luke Harding. The New Yorker piece was written by Jane Mayer. It was a profile of Christopher Steele. And it talked about how this whole thing got started because Britain's GCHQ, which is the British version of the NSA, was picking up a lot of what they called, the quote in the New Yorker was a stream of illicit communications. These were alarming enough to pass on to the American CIA. The detail that the CIA was slow on the draw in responding to these alarms was included in a lot of these stories. I remember at the time reading this story and thinking to myself, why is it that that they're telling us so much about the sources and methods and how we do surveillance overseas and how we use signals intelligence. Just to show you the story, this is the one I'm referring to. All right, Christopher Steele, the man behind the Trump dossier. This is one of a basically limitless number of stories. Before all this fell apart, there was this constant stream of profiles of Christopher Steele as this Le Carré-esque character, a master of shadows, a plain man who was compared often to George Smiley. This was one of those profiles, and in this profile, it talked about how the origin of this story was that it began with other countries alerting us to these suspicious communications between people in Trump's orbit and various nefarious Russian characters, oligarchs, sanctioned individuals, right? That was another term that came up a lot. But we never actually heard that story. So this is the part that was confusing to me as a news consumer and even as a journalist at the time. They told us in remarkable detail how all this stuff came about, who was talking to whom, when. They dated this activity to late 2015. which is extraordinarily interesting, given the fact that we were told that the beginning of the FBI investigation was July 31st. So what is this story about GCHQ talking to the CIA in late 2015 and this stream of illicit communications? Once they put that out there, I thought for sure the other shoe was going to drop at some point and they were going to tell us what those illicit communications were. But what we found out, what Michael and Alexandra and I learned, is that there was, they didn't release it because they didn't really have it. And this happened on both the front end and the back end. There is a series of rules governing how you can obtain legal signals, surveillance, and intercepts of American citizens, even if they're abroad. They actually went through that process with Carter Page, but you can do it informally through foreign partners with a lot more ease. The problem is what happens on the back end. How do you read this stuff? Because there's a separate set of rules that governs unmasking the people in the transcript. So let's just say you do capture a stream of illicit communications between a sanctioned Russian person and somebody in Trump's orbit. Well, you can't send a document back to the White House that with a big, yellow flashing light that says Trump person in it. It just says U.S. person identification. And one of the key parts of this whole story, and one of the reasons that we felt comfortable going forward with this, is that there was a lot of documentation about abuse of the unmasking procedures, not just involving Trump, but just generally. There were cases, one of the infamous cases that was cited involved the ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, who was identified as somebody who had made upwards of 260 requests to unmask anonymous U.S. persons in intercepts. And when confronted with that fact in executive session of the House Intelligence Committee, Power was kind of stymied. She replied that, yes, I made some requests, but nowhere near the number that's been reported in the news. And the conclusion ends up being that people were making requests in her name without her knowledge. There were all sorts of improprieties that went on. People would just say, I need to know this, so because I need to better understand this topic, and voila, the identities would be unmasked. And again, this is something that went on independently of Trump. The unmasking issue is something that they're going to have to get to. All of this is going to have to be reformed, probably, if anybody wants to take it seriously. But this is a very important detail, that there was no specific national security reason that caused all this at the beginning. I think a theory begins to develop that we simply abuse these tools quite a lot. Presidents do this quite a lot. They even do it for political purposes. There was an infamous story involving the use of FISA, in which the Barack Obama president, White House, supposedly accidentally or incidentally listened to members of Congress who were talking to Jewish leaders about their opposition to Obama's Iran deal. That story came out in the Wall Street Journal in, I believe it was 2015. The byline there was Adam Entis, who ended up moving to the Washington Post. But there's significant evidence that there was mass misuse and abuse of the unmasking procedures, not just for Donald Trump, but in all directions, and probably involving both parties. But the key here is that there's a suggestion that we did this a lot, and there was an opportunity to do it more than usual when Trump came along. This is a disliked deeply disliked, inexperienced politician who is seen as vulnerable, who as one source put it to me, wouldn't see this coming, and as a result, became a target of a number of very sophisticated surveillance requests. Now, why are we not afraid to report that absent the documentation? Because I've been very critical of reporters who were just simply told things by anonymous people, sources who I can't even classify, but people familiar with the matter. We didn't go as far as using that term, but this is a dangerous kind of reporting. One does not like to do this. Okay, so why were we comfortable doing it in this case? Well, for a lot of reasons. Mainly because what we were told, apart from the number, which is higher than what was known, and we haven't been able to identify all 26 of these people yet. But apart from the number, everything that we were told jibed with things that have come out in documentation, in court testimony, in congressional testimony, and in declassified materials over the course of the last 8 years. And there's ample evidence that something untoward is going on in the area of political espionage. And if you remember correctly, when all this came out, when it came out that there were informants who were sniffing around the Trump campaign early, the response to this, the propaganda response to this, was that, well, it was just they were doing it to inform, not to spy. That was actually one of the headlines when Halper's name came up. First, they claimed that releasing Halper's name would put his life in jeopardy, and then it turned out that Halper had actually been named as an intelligence informant in the New York Times way back in 1983. He was sort of infamously involved with the plan, the alleged plan to obtain Jimmy Carter's debate notes for Team Reagan in 1980. So, but the response has always been, well, yes, this happened, but it wasn't spying. But it was just investigation. But the predication upon closer examination starts to fall apart, and there's lots of documentation to back up what happened. So let's talk first about Halper. I'm going to share this tab. Okay, this is a letter to the Department of Defense for the Inspector General from Chuck Grassley's office, the senator from Iowa. Grassley is was an important figure, or has been an important figure in the investigation of all of this, even though this wasn't his team in HPSI that did this work. He did do quite a lot to bring things to light. And he's an interesting character. He is not a fan of corruption and waste of any kind, and will go after Republicans and Democrats. I've learned that over the years. And this story about a little thing called the Office of Net Assessment was right in Grassley's wheelhouse. If you remember, Grassley became a political celebrity for blasting the Pentagon for abuses like, charging tens of thousands of dollars for toilets or wrenches or coffee cups or whatever it is. So finding waste, fraud, and abuse inside the Department of Defense has been his bailiwick for a long time. Now, when word leaked out that the informant in the Russiagate cases, Stefan Halper, had been paid through something called the Office of Net Assessment, the ONA, in the Pentagon, Grassley leaped into action. and found there was actually public record, anybody can find it, of contracts awarded to Professor Halper. And he goes on to list them. Background on the ONA's solicitation and selection process, blah, blah, blah. Through the BAA process, the ONA awarded 4 contracts to Professor Halper between May 30th, 2012 and September 26th, 2016. Now, we will find out at the end that the total amount awarded for those 4 contracts across those 4 years was $1.05 million. And you, ladies and gentlemen, you are going to be very interested to see what he got paid for. But very specifically, in connection with this particular story, you see this one contract valued at $411,575, awarded on September 26th, 2016. That was awarded 3 days after a huge story broke in Yahoo. And I'm going to call it up right now just so that people remember it. Here we go. U.S. intel officials probe ties between Trump advisor and Kremlin. You will see that it talks about the activities of Trump advisor Carter Page, who has extensive business interests in Russia, has been discussed with senior members of Congress during recent briefings about suspected efforts by Moscow to influence the presidential election. Some of those briefed were taken aback when they learned about Page's contact in Moscow, viewing them as a possible back channel to the Russians. And this story is significant because this is the first moment when Christopher Steele is mentioned. He's not mentioned by name, but U.S. officials have since received intelligence reports that during that same 3-day trip, Page met with Igor Sechin, a longtime Putin associate and former Russian blah, blah, blah. So this story comes out September 23rd, 2016. Let's go back to the ONA. All right. He gets his contract on September 26, 2016, $411,000. Now, I was told by one source, I believe the quote's actually in here, that the ONA is it's a mail drop to pay off spies. There is a more profane version of that quote that I left out. There's another source who told us the Stefan Halper story is ridiculous. He was the consultant to write papers that weren't really papers and paid inflated sums like $400,000. He was conducting bumps and intelligence contacts. So we know independently that there was somebody who was making contacts with Trump associates who was paid an enormous sum of money to do so. We know that 2 other FBI confidential human sources, documented FBI confidential human sources, were also paid significant amounts of money around the time that the FISA against Carter Page was being generated. That includes Christopher Steele himself, who was actually fired as a CHS, as a source because he talked to the media, and the Brookings Institution fellow Igor Danchenko, who was paid a total of $200,000 during this period, and in an impressive display of chutzpah, actually tried to bill the FBI for $345,000 more dollars after he was outed as Steele's primary subsource in a report that basically said that he either made up the stories or was told them in a highly suspicious anonymous phone call that came to him, and which he deduced was a high-level Russian source. The FBI didn't pay him. Steele also wasn't paid his last bill. We'll get to that in a minute. So what is the Office of Net Assessment? What do you get paid for? Well, it's a scam. Basically, you get paid to write academic papers. Here's one of them. China, the Three Warfares is one of Halper's papers. And you write these papers. You'll notice that the bylines are not always there. In some rare cases, you will find that some other people are named in these documents. And it turns out that what you can do is you can hire somebody who works for a university in India or Indonesia and say, hey, I'll pay you $5,000 if you write 400 pages of whatever, and take that paper, put your own name on it, send it to the Pentagon, and they'll pay you $400,000 for it. They'll pay you the market rate for like a top-level celebrity autobiography for a paper that no one's ever going to read and that you didn't even write. In one of these instances, one of these papers was floating around long enough in the internet, and the real byline that included some of the actual authors. And way back in 2019, when I did a story on Halper involving an associate of his who had worked at Cambridge, I actually called up a former Indian naval officer who was living in New Delhi and working in a think tank there, who told me that, yes, I was the co-author of one of Stefan Halper's papers. I was paid a very modest sum to do the writing, and didn't want to say much beyond that, but I can tell you that this program stinks to high heaven. It's clearly just a mailbox for paying people off, and Halper did this repeatedly. I reached out to Halper for comment, by the way, and didn't get anything back. But we know that this happened. We know that there were approaches. We know that there were payments. How do we know that? Because, among other things, some of the documents that were declassified in the waning days of the Trump administration were reports about the activities of these folks. Now, I mentioned, and probably anybody who's a Russiagate aficionado knows this stuff, but there was the Crossfire Hurricane probe, which was about Donald Trump. Trump is Crossfire Hurricane. I guess somebody in the FBI group was a Rolling Stones fan. Beneath Crossfire Hurricane, they had a whole series of other crossfires. And each one of those was code names. So there's Crossfire Razor, who was Michael Flynn. Crossfire Dragon is, Carter Page, who couldn't be less dragon-like if you tried. Crossfire Typhoon, which is the then 20-something aide George Papadopoulos, who was barely even part of the Trump campaign when surveillance on him began. He came from the Ben Carson campaign. There's Crossfire Wind, who is a Lebanese-born fellow named Walid Fares. And then there's Crossfire Fury, who was Paul Manafort. And all of this is in these documents. These documents talk about surveilling all of these figures, about using listening devices to record their conversations, and making contact, arranging to make further contacts. But I wanted to highlight just a couple of things. So here's the stated justification for Crossfire Hurricane. Crossfire Hurricane investigative team is attempting to determine if anyone in the Trump campaign is in a position to have received information either directly or indirectly from the Russian Federation. All right, fine. All right. They didn't particularly have a real reason to think that at the time, and they had even less of a reason to think that if it actually turns out to be true, that Joseph Mifsud, the supposed original Russian source who approached George Papadopoulos, if he's actually not in the Russian orbit and is in the Western orbit, if that is borne out by more subsequently released documents, then this whole thing turns out to be even more rotten than it already is. It's already pretty bad. All right. On August 24th, 2016, the FBI creates an operational plan for how they are going to deal with their various investigative targets. Now listen to this. Here they're talking about Carter Page. CD is Crossfire Dragon. The main goal of the operation is to have CD admit that he has direct knowledge of and is either helping coordinate or assisting the Russian Federation conduct an active measure campaign within the Trump team. Then they go through the scenarios. If he admits it, then we're going to meet with the FBI headquarters and make a determination to take next steps. Blah blah blah. Then we're gonna really get things going. Then scenario 2: if Crossfire Dragon does not provide tangible information during the meeting, or if he explicitly states that he does not know of any Russian Federation involvement in the campaign, the FBI will focus on a second target of the investigation. Now, why does that matter? Because we later, in this same series of documents, and some of this stuff had already come out, but it's just important to look at these transcripts. Here's Halper. Now, I talked to Carter Page. I talked to I got in contact with Papadopoulos, some of the other folks. Page seems to have met with Halper on 4 occasions, at least 4 occasions. I think 4 occasions. On one occasion, he rode a bicycle all the way to Halper's to a farm that Halper had in Northern Virginia, and then he got back to that same place later on. Let me look at the date on this. It says 11/16/2016. Now that can't be right. But you can tell from the context that this is after the release of the Yahoo story identifying Carter Page as a possible back channel to the Kremlin. This poor guy who had never, been in the news for any big reason before in his life is suddenly identified as like the secret cutout who's arranging all of these hijinks between Trump and Putin. His name is plastered all over the place. Everybody wants to know what his deal is, and he's freaked out. And he's talking. He starts, opening up his heart to a person who probably put him in that position, Halper. And in that interview, he starts talking about the Yahoo News claim about his meetings with Igor Sechin and Devyekin. I can't remember if it's an Igor. Hang on a second. Let me. I just don't want to mispronounce my Russian here. Igor Devyekin. And Halper says, "What's the core argument they're making?" And Page says, well, the core argument, one of the core lies, and this is also the irony of it, right? The core lie is that I met with these sanctioned Russian officials, several of which I've never even met in my entire life. But they said I met them in July. This is Sechin is the main guy, the head of Rosneft. There's another guy I'd never even heard of. He's like in the inner circle. What's his name again? I can't even remember. It's just so outrageous. And then Halper says he's in the inner circle. He works in the Kremlin or something. But he's, not someone, again, I was asking, blah, blah, blah. And he goes on to talk about how he doesn't know him. They're hardly known and they may not. It's just so outrageous. It defies any logic whatsoever. Well, why does this matter? This matters because this explicit denial of Page's, him saying, I don't even know these people they're claiming that I met with. I've never even heard of them. It doesn't make its way into the FISA application. That's one thing. The second thing is, despite their written arrangement to move on to another target, in fact, they specify later that that's supposed to be Crossfire Typhoon, who's Papadopoulos. They don't do that. They don't move on after he denies everything, after he doesn't cough up any kind of incriminating statements. Instead, they go forward, and there is a series of moments in which senior, high-ranking FBI officials decide that they're going to proceed with an investigation and with a FISA application against Page, despite the fact that they don't have anything on him. Let me see if I can find the exact. Okay, there is a moment, for instance, on October 19th of 2016, in which there was an acting assistant attorney general named Stuart Evans who was wigged out about this whole thing, basically saying, like, this is politically sensitive. We can't just we can't do this. And he was giving everybody a hard time. He was being a stick in the mud about it. If you know anything about Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, they texted about this. Oh my God, Stu Evans is giving us a hard time about this FISA. And they even have a discussion, these two FBI agents involved in this case. We might have to bring the deputy director in to smooth this whole thing over. And that's when Andrew McCabe actually does have a conversation with Evans. This is part of the Horowitz report, the Inspector General's report in this whole thing. You can look it up. It's a massive document that probably very few journalists in mainstream media read all the way through, but it's got all kinds of stuff in there. So on October 19th, McCabe told Evans something to the effect of, I hear you, I understand, but we can't pull any punches and we've got to do it and let the chips fall where they may. So this is 2 days before they file the FISA. This is the FBI saying, we're going to go forward with this investigation, even though we have nothing, or rather the only thing that we have is from paid opposition research from a source who later turned out to be at the zoo when he was getting the key information, when he was supposedly getting the key information that Page was involved in coordinating with Russia to illegally impact the election. So 2 days before they file this surveillance warrant, which incidentally gave them a window not just into Carter Page, but into anybody who contacted Carter Page, thanks to something called the two-hop rule. So this gave them a surveillance window into the whole Trump campaign. They did this on the strength of absolutely nothing. They had nothing on this guy. They had denials on record when they sent informants after him. they not only didn't come back with anything, they came back with the opposite of something. They came back with exculpatory information. Exculpatory information in hand, they pressed forward. They lied to the FISA court. They continued this investigation. None of these investigations of any of these informants led anywhere near a prosecution for anything like espionage or coordination with Russia. And this surveillance warrant on Page was the reed on which they hung a great deal of the investigation. It's what kept it alive. There was even a closure order for Michael Flynn, who was one of the first targets. And so why do I bring this up? Because there's one more document I want to show you, and this came up in a lawsuit involving Michael Flynn. It's an interview with William Barnett. It's a review from the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Missouri, has been conducting an ongoing review of the FBI investigation that led to charges in Flynn's case. Now, there's what they call a 302 of Barnett. Barnett was a special agent who was part of both the Crossfire Hurricane probe and later on the special counsel investigation, I believe, of Robert Mueller. But there's a lot of incredible details in this one interview. Barnett thought the Crossfire Hurricane investigation was opaque, with little detail concerning specific evidence of criminal events. Barnett thought the case theory was supposition on supposition. Barnett thought the predication in the Razor investigation, that's Flynn, was not great. We go down. Barnett did not see any evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. Barnett thought there was a get Trump attitude by some at the SCO. And here he kind of elaborates. Barnett said the second way the get Trump attitude was exhibited was what he referred to as Mueller's all-stars, which was a term that was used in news articles describing the special counsel office. All the attorneys wanted to be part of something big, a successful prosecution. Barnett said it was not necessarily get Trump, but more the conviction that there was something criminal there and a competition as to which attorney was going to find it. They even had a collusion game, and this is something that Barnett and his friends, there are a number of people named in this interview who seem to be very, very skeptical of this investigation. Talking about, here it is, in the hypothetical game, investigators are able to choose any character conducting any activity in any location and pair this individual with another character and interpret it as evidence of collusion. So this is something that was done between people who were investigating this case. I mean, this is something that's going to come up in Thursday's story too, that there was significant internal disquiet and discord and dissent, even within this investigation, that we never heard about in all those gazillions of stories about the Crossfire Hurricane probe. We weren't told when FBI Director James Comey made his dramatic presentation to the House on March 20th of 2017. Remember, he stood up there and, he said, I have been authorized by the Department of Justice to confirm that there is a Department of Justice, that there's an FBI investigation into, Russian influence activities and any links between, the Trump campaign and blah, blah, blah. I can find the exact quote, but whatever. If you remember, that moment was played up on television like it was the second coming of Watergate. John Dean was interviewed for it. Little did we know that the investigation had been, we did know that it had been going on since July, but we didn't know that they hadn't found anything, that they had been searching online, and they were completely empty-handed at that moment. Shortly after that dramatic announcement by Comey, let's see. Shortly after that dramatic announcement by Comey, there was a second major development in the Russiagate story, and that was this thing. FBI obtained FISA warrant to monitor former Trump advisor Carter Page. So this story took the factual detail that, yes, there had been approved FISA warrants on Carter Page, and they concluded, both correctly and incorrectly, that this tended to mean that he was an agent of a foreign power. At the time, and this is what they wrote, the FBI, blah, 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 after convincing a FISA judge that there was probable cause to believe Page was acting as an agent of a foreign power, this is the clearest evidence so far that the FBI had reason to believe during the 2016 presidential campaign that a Trump associate was in touch with Russian agents. Now, that was completely wrong. And nobody accounted for the idea that the FISA court could have been lied to. But these two big events, the Comey's announcement of an investigation and this leak that of a FISA warrant, which is a very serious offense, that indicated that Carter Page was an agent of a foreign power, drove, a lot of the mania. Again, it was one of those things where there was a delay. If we had known in April of 2017 that the FISA warrant application had been falsified, that they had left out the denials, that they hadn't actually found anything in their surveillance of him, that the only evidence that came from against him came from paid opposition research, then we would have thought about this story completely differently, but we didn't. It was always this delay. And, there's an element of what Michael Alexandra and I found out in the Twitter files too, of pre-bunking, right? This idea of creating a false impression with audiences, so that they're insulated against later revelations like this one. But those two stories rested on the idea that, that there was a legitimate investigation going on, and we now find out that this wasn't the only thing. I'm going through these documents because this is backup for what we were told. And there were a lot of quotes in these stories. The sources told us, for instance, that they had found logs in the unmasking requests, and they describe a lot of this looks like one area where there was no justifications for any of these unmaskings from a national security perspective. There are some specific people that who were in touch with, apparently in touch with Trump officials. That's going to be in tomorrow's story. That's going to be pretty shocking when you find out about that. But the overarching theme was they could not find the initial predication for any of this. And this is important because as we got further into this, we started to identify people who we think are some of the other targets. Obviously, we already knew the five, but there are some others: Keith Kellogg, Sam Clovis, other Trump officials, and one of the quote is, "These were identified as people to bump, make contacts, or manipulate. They were targets of our own IC and law enforcement, targets for collection." The Mueller investigation, we were told, was a setup. The predicate was a setup based on private information, institutional biases. The team he put together was comprised of ideologues from the Crossfire Hurricane team that broke procedure, talked about using falsified documents. And there's some other details. We were told essentially that this operation began with the CIA on the impetus of John Brennan, and this is important because Brennan ends up being a character in later parts of the story that come out. Ultimately, what we were told, there are two main components to what we find out. One is that there is a broad political espionage campaign that begins perhaps as early as late 2015. It involves a variety of agencies, the CIA, the FBI. There's some coordination clearly with the Clinton campaign at some point, but it also involves foreign intelligence allies, some of whom we can identify directly, like the GCHQ. And there was the story we were told in the news was that this whole thing was generated overseas, that the warnings went from there to here. We were told that it was the opposite, that the interest came here and the request went that way. And this is a major, re-understanding of what happened in 2016. And none of us would feel confident in doing this story if we had so consistently not gotten answers about how this whole thing started. The official explanation for the beginning of Crossfire Hurricane was always preposterous. This idea that there was this conversation supposedly over wine involving George Papadopoulos and this Australian diplomat who, of his own volition, just happens to walk into the office of the future leader of the CIA and tells a story that instantly generates this incredibly politically sensitive operation, and they immediately proceed with. By the way, it's worth noting the FBI, in order to operate overseas, needs the permission of foreign intelligence services. That has to be brokered by our own intelligence services overseas, which means in the case of Britain that the future CIA director Gina Haspel was instrumental in kickstarting the whole Russiagate probe. But the important thing was this whole thing began with us. They were searching around for a predicate. If you look at the early Steele reports, they were about Central Asia, they're about hotels. They didn't really focus on Russia until pretty late in the game. It was, show me the person, I'll find the crime. That was absolutely the case with these folks. They didn't have the predicate at the beginning of this whole thing, and even the initial report about Michael Flynn, which wasn't March 2016, it was actually March 2014. It was a dinner that he attended with some other British intelligence operatives, retired folks like Richard Dearlove, the historian Christopher Andrew. There was a Russian woman who just happened to be at the dinner, and apparently there was a report that was generated years later and then leaked to reporters at the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Guardian, the Times of London years after the fact, claiming that Flynn had not reported this very, very brief contact with this Russian woman, and that there was concern in the agencies. Well, Flynn had just passed a review for security clearance as he was leaving the Defense Intelligence Agency. This was an absolute non-issue that was created in the press way after the fact. The Russia angle was just something that was thought up years later, and it fits with this general pattern of we're going to just investigate these folks, and we'll find the reason later. Now, I'm just going to look for some of the other details. So there's a long story about how all this material and the battle to get this stuff out, that is going to be the subject of the story that comes out in public tomorrow. It is very interesting. You're going to find out some interesting details about the specific kinds of things that our foreign partners were reporting back. But what you won't find is solid predication, anything that points to a legitimate national security reason for any of this to have happened. Basically, they ran a game on us. It was a timing game. We heard first of all that there was a possible back channel to the Kremlin, but that was added on by paid opposition research. Nobody had any idea. Probably even the reporter Michael Isikoff had no idea exactly what the provenance of that was. And sometimes we're in the dark on these things, and that's why I bring up the fact that this is also a story that we're basing on source accounts, but it's something that's been floating around for a while, and there's a lot of background material that suggests that this version of events is accurate. We know there was a quantity of people who were placed under surveillance. We know there was a quantity of informants. We know there was an operational plan to approach these people. We know they were highly compensated. We know that there was a mix of taxpayer-funded compensation for these sources and private compensation. I mean, think about this, folks. One person described this to me as a state-sponsored Oppo research, state-sponsored Oppo research at penthouse prices. And think about that. I mean, we paid enormous sums to these folks to do what exactly? To dig up derogatory, what they call DROG files on relatively small players within the Trump organization. Again, Page, was involved with the Trump campaign for like a hot minute. Papadopoulos only just got there before he was already being approached by somebody. He was, handed cash by one of the informants. If he had actually gotten on a plane with that cash and flown home, they were ready to arrest him with it. They had a honeypot scheme where he was approached by a very attractive woman in one instance. So we know that this happened, but what's missing is the predication. They got away with this in the press by telling us what was in the Steele dossier, basically, that he was a possible back channel, that there was this mysterious communication, that there was a possible deal involving, the reduction of sanctions in exchange for new policies that would undercut U.S. foreign policy objectives. None of that stuff came from anything organic. It was all invented. It was all stuff that they had to pay for to get. And people should be outraged by this, and they should stop thinking about this as a story about Donald Trump that was wrong, which is actually a mistake that I made for years. I thought this is a wrong news story. It's an incorrect, badly reported story. You think about poor Jeff Gerth, the brilliant Pulitzer Prize winning reporter who wrote a 24,000 word deconstruction of the reporting in Russiagate and published it in the Columbia Journalism Review. He worked very hard to make sure that it didn't appear in an outlet that, you know, could be viewed as biased or as lacking credibility. He puts it there, and instead of there being any reckoning, any kind of reconsideration of any of what happened, people just moved on as if he didn't even write it. Now, I mean, of course, it was noticed and it had an impact, but this idea of, you know, we're gonna get through to the journalistic community by pointing out that they were wrong about this stuff. Once they see that, you know, the sourcing on this was bad and that they were kind of screwed with by some of their unnamed sources, they're gonna get upset. Just like I'm gonna get upset if I turn out to be burned on this thing, and I'm gonna be embarrassed, and I'm gonna have to apologize to all of you. We thought that would happen once this wrong story was corrected. Well, it turns out that the wrong story was a distraction, that we should have been focusing on what actually happened. And if we had just done that, if we had focused on what we knew, why were there informants following around Trump folks? What exactly was the predication? What was the original thing that led them down that road? We never really got that answer. They gave us a bad answer, and people like me treated it as, well, that's stupid, and journalists shouldn't fall for it. And let's see if that holds up under closer examination. But actually, we should have been looking for the whole story. When were people first approached? Was it before July 31st? If it was, why? And when you start looking at it in that terms, when you clear away all the noise and all the stuff that happened, you know, after Trump got elected, what you get is a whole lot of indications that there was a significant surveillance operation that predates the FBI probe. Then there is the FBI probe that is conducted improperly and based on improper foundation. And after that, there's the second half of the story that we're going to get to, which is a sort of a combination of a cover-up and a campaign of what I would call mutinous obstruction, where rather than just trying to bury this in the past, which I think was the plan, everybody thought probably that Hillary was going to win. They proceeded to double and triple down on this thing in a variety of ways, but in one particular way that we were able to examine in very close detail and is pretty shocking. That's going to be Thursday's story. We'll get to that, but essentially, but I'll give you the shorthand version. It's about the intelligence community assessment of 2017 that said that Russian influence activities had been conducted to denigrate Hillary Clinton and to help President-elect Trump's electoral chances. That report is a fascinating study, given what we were told. It's a kind of a worse sequel to the infamous National Intelligence Estimate of 2002, when we were led to war in Iraq and certain information was left out of the document. Here, a slightly different method was used, but the result was the same. Essentially, we had phony intelligence or incorrect intelligence that was served as the basis for the beginning of something highly ambitious, but that should never have happened. Now that we are able to look fully at the information that was available to them at the time. So we're going to be able to look at that. I'm going to be able to tell you a little bit about stuff they overlooked back then. But this is the story. So we have surveillance campaign, and after that, there's going to be a story about how they covered this up. Incidentally, just one quick thing I wanted to mention, and I wanted to give a shout out to a reporter who shall remain nameless, but if that person's listening, knows that I'm very grateful for their help in pointing this out. But the term election interference, Russian interference, if you look at the National Intelligence Council's definition of election interference in 2021, you'll see that they're talking about interference with the machinery of balloting of elections, ballot boxes, vote counting, hacking. And actually, if you look in this original Yahoo story about Carter Page, you'll see that there are hints about concerns. Hang on a second. This is an important point. I'm sorry to take up your time. I know it's been a while, but okay, here we go. The questions about Page come amid mounting concerns within the U.S. intelligence community about Russian cyber attacks on the Democratic National Committee and state election databases in Arizona and Illinois. So this story hinted at real collusion and real election interference. They were talking about hacking databases in September of 2023. This is, I'm almost positive, one of the reasons that polls showed that a significant portion of Democratic voters believe that there had been actual hacking of ballot boxes in 2016. It's also the reason that you had a variety of stories that logically didn't make a lot of sense when combined with what the U.S. government actually said later. For instance, folks might remember that there was a great hubbub about the question of whether Trump lawyer Michael Cohen had been in Prague. Now, why does everybody remember that? The idea that Cohen was in Prague, this was important because that was mentioned in the Steele dossier, as something that was happening. He was there to meet with the Russian hackers. Well, what Russian hackers? What's the allegation about Russian hackers that ever actually appeared in this story in any meaningful way? Because the only thing that they ever actually alleged publicly was the use of social media, the buying of a very, very small amount of ads. If you combine the election ads that were purchased before the election, and there were some other ads that they purchased to promote certain rallies and encourage people to go to them, if you add it all up, according to one court filing, it comes out to about under $5,000 worth of stuff. So it's stuff that was on RT. This is what was in the intelligence community assessment, and that is why the government never used the word interference. They used the word influence campaign or influence operations. If you read carefully what the intelligence community was saying from the very start of this whole thing, they never went to interference. However, the big newspapers did talk about interference, and this came out in Jeff Gerth's Columbia Journalism Review opus. The New York Times talked about, what this being one of the most effective interference campaigns in American history. The Pulitzer Committee, when it gave the New York Times and the Washington Post prizes for their coverage of this thing. Talked about rewarding them for their deeply sourced research and coverage of Russian election interference, something that was never alleged by anybody, but it was implied, it was implanted in our heads through these multiple little avenues along the side. And all this was, now I look back at it now, I remember thinking, these stories are strange. Why are they doing this stuff? Well, now it starts to make a little bit more sense. And if you think about it in terms of, a distraction from a larger narrative, the creation of one narrative, people had to unlearn the idea that there was collusion and that there was hacking and that there was this and that before they could even begin to countenance a bigger question. And when there were even questions in that direction, of course, they instantly caricatured that as Spygate and conspiracy theory. But you don't have to rely just on that. Just look at what's in the documents. Look at the fact that we know that there were at least 7 people who were approached by confidential human sources, that 5 of them had FBI code names, and that they never ever produced anything like legitimate predication for any of those folks. So, and that the idea that this was that there was coordination between all of these people, and that all of them were involved in some, unified field theory of Trump coordination with Russia. There's nothing like that even alleged in any of these documents. We see them hoping to get it in interviews by their informants, but they don't get it. They get confused, horrified denials, which they then leave out of documents. Don't tell the press. It's highly, highly significant also. And I want folks to think about this. The delay is central to the whole understanding of this whole thing. Think about James Comey getting up before Congress and talking about this investigation, and leaving out the part where they hadn't gotten anything, that there was no progress towards proving out any of this. James Clapper had actually said on television that we didn't have any evidence of collusion just 15 days before that on television on March 5th. But nobody remembered that. But more importantly, they left out incredibly key details that they did know. They knew that private opposition research that had been paid for by the Clinton campaign figured in this picture. They knew it well enough that they had to put it in a footnote. They eventually had to put it in a footnote to the FISA warrant. But they didn't tell the public about that. While they were leaking like a sieve in every other direction, they forced everybody to discover that the hard way, and it didn't come out until October of 2017 that this information, this P-tape stuff, the blackmail material, all of that, that the source of it was Trump's political opponent. Again, if we had known that at the beginning, it would have been a completely different story. The delay is key. The fact that if you go back and you watch these appearances, these announcements, and you think about the things that they knew at the time and we're not saying, we're not leaking to reporters, it starts to look like a very different story at that point. And that really bolsters a lot of what we've been told. And there's more to come. There's more leads that we have to follow up. We have 3 stories written. There are more in the hopper that we're going to have to write. But today is an introduction. Thanks everybody for coming out today. And someone's asking why I did not know I was a germaphobe. I'm not a germaphobe particularly. Curious where that came from. But in any case, we hope that this leads to, it's our belief that if all the materials are declassified, that we're finally going to be able to piece together the entire thing. There's already enough, I think, in the public record to demolish the story that we were told at the beginning, and there's a big head start on the next phase of it, which is building up what actually happened. You add to that the source material that we got in the last 3 weeks. We've gotten pretty close. Some of this stuff has been reported by other reporters. We just got a little bit more detail, but the public needs to demand that all of this stuff be released. There is no legitimate reason for this stuff to be classified anymore. It's of major national importance and electoral importance, because this is a new kind of scandal, right? This idea of having whole institutions involved in creating fake news and in creating investigations. We had never seen that before. And, at least in Watergate, they had to commit a third-rate burglary to do their spying. In this case, they were able to create a quasi-legal avenue towards surveillance. So anyway, I'm rambling on. Thanks everybody for coming out. I just wanted to explain, why it is we felt comfortable doing this. And also, I want to give props to Michael and Alexandra, who really worked hard to get all this stuff. They have a pretty sensational thing coming out tomorrow in public. And here on Racket, there's going to be material coming out beginning tomorrow, but also on Thursday, there's going to be some significant stuff that's going to come out in this site. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and I'll see you again soon. And let me know in the comment section of perhaps the Racket site, if you have any questions about the story you think are unanswered. Please let me know and I'll try to answer them. Thanks everybody. Take care. Have a good night.